Some men are built to perform. Marcus DuBois was one of them. Raised in the sugarcane parishes of Louisiana, Marcus carried every expectation out of St. Mary Parish on a full scholarship and didn't look back. What followed were 15 years of self-destroying ambition, a beautiful marriage, a daughter who made lists to count the days until she saw him, and a slow, invisible unraveling that ended on the floor of a one-bedroom apartment in Kenner, a bottle within reach, with nothing left to perform for and no one left to fool. Some men are destroyed by the pressing. Others discover what they're made of. Crushed like a sugarcane is the story of Marcus and Seresse DuBois, told in 2 movements across 2 books, tracing one family's journey through faith, forgiveness, and the relentless work of learning to love. From a drunk driving arrest that costs him everything, to a jail cell where he finally runs out of alternatives to prayer, to the slow rebuilding of a life that turns out to be far more solid than anything he previously constructed, Marcus's story is brutally honest about what collapse looks like, and luminous about what can grow from the roots that survive it. Seresse's story runs alongside his, a woman of deep and practical faith navigating loving someone who cannot yet be reached, raising a daughter in the debris of a broken marriage, and learning at a women's retreat on her knees, years before any resolution was visible, that releasing someone can be the highest form of love. And then there is Nia, who made lists, who prayed every night since she was small for a father she kept counting the days towards seeing him, who inherited, without knowing it, the prayers of a great-great-grandfather she never met. In the sugarcane fields of South Louisiana, the crushing is not the end of the story. The sweetness is locked inside. It cannot be extracted any other way. This sweeping 2-book novel weaves together the threads of ambition and inheritance, addiction and grace, the long patience of prayer, and the daily demanding, deeply rewarding practice of genuine love. It is a story about what faith looks like when it has been tested past the breaking point, and what it produces on the other side, crushed like a sugarcane. Chapter 1, What the Ground Takes. The morning they buried his mother, Marcus Emmanuel DuBois stood at the edge of the grave with his hands in his pockets and watched the rain turn the red Louisiana clay into something that looked like an open wound. He had not cried yet. He wondered if he ever would. There were people around him, cousins he hadn't seen in a decade, women from his mother's church clutching umbrellas and weeping softly into embroidered handkerchiefs, a preacher whose name he couldn't remember, speaking words that fell on him like rain falls on stone. But Marcus felt none of it. He felt only the cold and the peculiar hollowness that follows when the one person in the world who truly knew you is placed into the earth and covered. Her name was Celestine Marie DuBois, née Fontenot. She had been 63 years old when the stroke took her in the kitchen of the small yellow house on Rue des Fleurs, a street that had not had flowers in it since Marcus was a boy. Peaceful, Doris had said. She had not suffered. Marcus had nodded at that, because that was what you did when people said such things, but he knew that his aunt was wrong, as well-meaning individuals often tended to be. His mother had suffered. She had suffered every day of her life in ways that had nothing to do with her death. And the fact that the end itself had been quiet did not undo any of what had come before. He had not been there. That was the thing he could not shake. He had been 300 miles away, in a city that had chewed him up and was in the process of spitting him out, and his mother had died alone in her kitchen on a Friday afternoon, with the radio playing gospel and the beans beginning to scorch on the stove. His Aunt Doris had found her when she had come to borrow sugar. Marcus had gotten the call at 6 in the evening, and he had sat in his car in a parking garage for 2 hours before he could make himself drive. The preacher was saying something about resurrection, about seeds, about how what is placed in the ground is not the real thing, that the real thing ascends. Marcus looked at the plain pine coffin being lowered on straps and thought about how his mother had always wanted to be buried in something nice, something with satin lining, and he had not been able to afford it. He had scraped together what he could, called in favors of people who no longer owed him any, and still it had not been enough for anything but the basic arrangement. Seresse DuBois had spent her whole life making do with what was basic and plain, and now in death she had been given more of the same. Marcus felt the shame of that like a fishhook in his sternum. She had deserved better. The rain intensified. Someone held an umbrella over Marcus's head, and he looked to his left and saw his cousin Thibodeau. Tibbs, they'd called him Fat Tibbs, now a grown man with reading glasses on a chain around his neck, holding an umbrella over Marcus with the same easy generosity he'd always had. Marcus wanted to say something, thank you at minimum. But words had become difficult for him in the last few years. They required more energy than he had, and what energy he did have was spent on simply remaining upright. She talked about you all the time, Tibbs said quietly, looking at the grave. Every Sunday after church he'd call Mama, and Mama would ask how she was doing, and she would say, I'm fine, I'm praying for my Marcus. Every single Sunday. Marcus said nothing. She never gave up on you, Tibbs continued. I want you to know that. Whatever she said to your face, whatever happened between you all, she never gave up. She believed you were going to be all right. The coffin reached the bottom of the grave with a sound that Marcus felt in his back teeth. He thought, I am 41 years old, and I am standing in the rain watching them bury my mother, and I have nothing to show for any of it. No wife, no daughter who speaks to me, no house, no savings, no job worth naming. I have a duffel bag in the trunk of a car with 200,000 miles on it, and a bottle of bourbon under the seat, and a cell phone with a cracked screen. And those are the material facts of my life at this moment. These are the coordinates of what I have become. He had been once something else entirely. He had been a young man of such promise that people used the word gifted around him with care, as though it was the last of something precious. He had been a boy who read everything, could make quick, complex calculations in his head, and, as was expected, had won a full scholarship to Louisiana State University. He left home with a trunk full of books and the terrifying electric certainty that his life was about to begin. And it had. For a time it truly had. But that was before he had crossed over the border into no man's land. It had happened so gradually that he hadn't noticed until he was already too far in to find his way back. Before was his mother's voice on the phone, proud, bright, and unguarded. Before was a woman named Seresse who had looked at him across a crowded room and smiled like she recognized him from somewhere important. Before, there was a little girl named Nia who used to climb him like a tree and fall asleep on his chest with her small hand curled around his finger. All of that was before. This was now. A grave in the rain. A man at its edge who had been bearing the full burden of his own life for so long, pressed under it so completely that he had lost any clear sense of where he began or ended. A man who had been pressed and pressed until whatever sweetness was in him had run out, leaving only the dry husk of what remained. The preacher finished. People began to move. Tibbs touched Marcus on the shoulder and said something about coming to the reception at Aunt Doris's house, about food, about sitting together. Marcus nodded, and stayed where he was. He watched the grave workers begin their business. He watched the red clay slowly cover the pine. He stayed until they were done, until the mound was tidy and the flowers were arranged, and the grave workers had gone to their truck to eat sandwiches and wait for the next one. The church women were the last to leave. Marcus noticed them going, 6 of them moving under umbrellas in a cluster, murmuring together with the intimacy of women who have prayed together for decades and carry that intimacy into every other part of their lives. One of them, a small woman, with a face that was entirely composed of the lines left by a long life of feeling things, turned at the edge of the cemetery and looked back at Marcus still standing by the grave. She did not wave. She did not call him. She simply looked at him for a long moment, with an expression he could not fully interpret from a distance, and then she turned and walked on. He did not know it then. He would understand it later. She had been praying for him. Right there at the cemetery gate, she stopped and prayed for him. For Seresse DuBois' church sisters, praying was the most natural thing a person could do when they saw someone who needed it. His mother had been surrounded by prayer her entire adult life, had built her life inside it like a house built around a hearth, the fire at the center of everything. The church had not been an institution to Celestine. It had been the medium in which she moved, the grammar of her daily life, the structure that gave shape and meaning to everything, from her Friday red beans to her Tuesday morning phone calls to her sister in Shreveport. Prayer had been as essential to her as the breath she breathed naturally, without pretense and without advertisement. Marcus had left all of that behind at the age of 18. Not dramatically, not with announcement or argument. He had simply stopped going to church when he went to college, because college was where you left the things of your childhood behind, and the church had felt like a thing of his childhood, the low wooden pews, the heat of the summer sanctuary, the deacons in their Sunday suits, the hymns whose words he'd known since before he understood what they meant. He had left it all behind. He had not thought about what he was leaving behind, had not considered, in the confident secular brightness of a young man going somewhere, that the faith that had held his family for generations was not a relic of a smaller life, but a root, deep, invisible, doing its work underground, sustaining things on the surface that would not know they were sustained until the root was gone. Now, standing by his mother's grave in the rain, Marcus felt the absence of the root. He felt it like a tooth that has been extracted, the tip of the tongue always wandering over the space where it had been. Marcus DuBois walked back to his car through the rain and sat in the driver's seat for a long time. The bottle was right there under the seat where it always was, and his hand found it as a drowning man's hand finds whatever is nearest. He did not go to Aunt Doris's reception. He drove to the edge of town and parked by the levee and watched the river and drank, and thought about the different ways a man can be buried before the actual dirt goes over him, and felt the rain on the roof of the car like a drum beating out a rhythm. He could not name but recognize nonetheless the sound of time passing without him, the sound of the world continuing its indifferent business, while Marcus Emmanuel DuBois sat in a parking lot at 41 years old and tried to find one good reason to start the car. And yet, beneath the bourbon and the hollow and the shame, something else was present. Small and stubborn as a seed pressed under clay, he would not have been able to name it that night, lying in the dark motel. But it was there, the faintest memory of being the boy in the pew beside his mother, feeling the deep communal hum of the congregation around him, the sense of being held inside something larger than himself, something that had been there before him and would be thereafter, something that his mother had known the name of. and that he had walked away from because he thought he had found better names. He had not found better names. The dark came. He closed his eyes. Crushed Like a Sugarcane is available in paperback, hardcover, and Kindle format, and can be purchased online at Amazon.com by clicking on the link found in the description.